Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Today's lecture will be based on chapter 6 of Hill and Myatt anti-textbook. So we have studied about consumers and about firms. Basically, the standard conventional story that you are told in economics is built on two sides. One is the demand side, which comes from the consumers, and the other is the supply side, which comes from the industries. Industry is just a collection of firms, and one of the most basic and fundamental mistakes which is made in conventional textbooks is the what's called the fallacy of composition, that you can take a collection of consumers just and get the properties just by adding up the behavior of individual consumers. This is the most fundamental point of complexity theory, which is the latest name for this phenomena, that the sum of the behavior of n individuals does not add up. The group is not the same as the collection of its parts, because there are interactions which take place among people, which if you look at one individual in isolation, this interaction doesn't take place. Similarly, industry is a collection of firms, and in standard economic theory, the supply curve for the industry is just the sum of the supply curves for all the firms. But actually, this is not true. So, as we have discussed, we are studying meta theory. So, we are going to study what the textbooks say and also what the reality is separately. But these two things have to be kept separate. So the theory has a lot of illusion. It looks like it's very powerful and mathematical and sophisticated and deep, but the reality of it is nothing. It's an illusion. So actually the Quran says, لا يغرنك تقلب الذين كفروا في البلاد, that don't be impressed, don't be deceived by the apparent power and pomp and circumstance and luxury of those who do not believe. Oops, slideshow doesn't change. So when we talk about an industry, then there are many types of market structure. One of them, which receives the maximum attention in textbooks, is the structure of perfect competition, where there are lots of small firms within the industry, and each firm is so small that it doesn't have any market power, and so basically it does not set prices, it takes prices as given. The second type of market structure is called monopolistic competition. This is again a structure in which there is lots of small firms, and they don't really have a lot of market power, but it's like toothpaste, where each firm is small but they still have differentiated products, so they create. And actually the reality is that all firms want to have market power, so even if you start with perfect competition, firms will try to put some distinguishing feature on their product, like branding, etc., which is nothing other than the same product, but the packaging is different, and now this creates market power, and the same toothpaste with the same exact product in the carton can sell for different prices due to market power. So that's monopolistic competition. Once you have this, then you have some amount of market power. Now, an oligopoly is when you have big firms, many big firms, each of them has market power, and one of the basic distinctions between monopolistic competition and oligopoly is that in oligopoly there is strategic interaction. The different firms are aware of each other and they have to respond to the action, then they can be hurt or helped by the others. If they cooperate, they can do better, and if they don't. In monopolistic competition, each firm is small and acts on its own. So there is no strategic interaction between the firms. And finally, you have the monopoly, where you have only one firm which controls the market. Now, which kind of market structure will emerge? This partly depends on the cost structure of the firms. So if you have increasing returns to scale, then it will be efficient to have one large firm, because if you divide this one large firm into two firms, both of them will be producing at small scale, both of them will incur fixed costs, and so the cost of production overall will be higher. And so there is something in your standard theory, there is a U-shaped marginal cost curve, and so the bottom of that cost curve is the place where you should be producing, because it has the lowest costs. Actually, the bottom of the average cost curve is the place where you have minimum cost of production, and so that's the efficient scale, that's the scale at which every firm should produce. If this minimum efficient scale is small relative to the size of the aggregate demand, then you will have lots of firms, and so you can have a competitive industry. If this minimum efficient scale is large, then you will have an oligopoly, and if it's very large, then you will have a monopoly. So that's how it would behave in an ideal world, but actually things are not quite like that in reality. Now, the basic goal of your conventional economics textbook is to prove the efficiency of the free market. Now, the goal of the textbook is that it wants to show that the government shouldn't regulate, the firm should be allowed to do whatever they want, and the only condition under which this can happen is if you have perfect competition. In fact, there is another way of thinking about it. You can say that whenever you have selfish firms who are trying to maximize, and whenever they have any amount of market power, they will cause damage. So the only condition in which firms who are greedy and who are selfish and who are profit maximizing cannot do damage is when they are so small that they have no market power. This is the right way to think about the invisible hand. What you are taught is the wrong way to think about the invisible hand, is that perfect competition is good. Actually, perfect competition is not good. Any competition and allowing freedom to firms is not good except for the very exceptional case where the firm have simply no power to actually cause damage, because they cannot set prices and they cannot take advantage of their power. So this is the framework, but the textbook teach you the opposite frame of mind, because they are out to prove. Textbooks are a part of an ideology which is attempting to prove that you should allow the firms to operate, because the firms have written the textbooks. The corporations who are in control have dominated the world, and they have caused the writing of these textbooks to allow them the power to exploit the world and to teach the world that this is the best that it can do. So, you see, the theorem that is taught to you in textbook is that the free market works wonderfully under perfect competition. And what are the assumptions? That all firms must be small price takers, you must have homogeneous identical goods, there has to be perfect information, there has to be zero transaction cost. You can go to any firm and buy the goods, you don't have any cost to get there, to find out the information and to buy. You should have small minimum efficient scale relative to aggregate demand. This ensures rising marginal cost and limits the size of the firm. You should have free entry and exit in order to ensure that if any firm is making excess profits, more firms come in and reduce that excess profit. And there should be no externalities, which we will discuss later. So if any one of these conditions is violated, then the theorem fails. So in fact, one way to read this theorem about efficiency of free markets, which is the opposite of what the textbooks teach, is that it is impossible for free markets to be efficient in the real world, because there are so many conditions required that they cannot possibly be fulfilled. But this is not how the textbooks read it. The textbook read it in the opposite way. They say that these are the conditions under which free markets are efficient, and therefore forget about the conditions, free markets are efficient. This is sort of a ridiculous way of argument, but this is exactly what the textbooks teach. Now, actually, you can take these exact same textbooks and the exact same theorem and interpret it to say that, look, these are the conditions, these are the only conditions under which free markets can be efficient, and obviously none of these conditions are met in the real world, and so free markets are not efficient. So basically the textbooks are teaching propaganda. These conditions are impossible to meet, but this is the central model. 400 pages of manicular or variant are devoted to this perfect competition, and then in the end a few chapters show what happens under imperfect competition, but it's sort of dismissed that, okay, these are sort of unlikely things which would never happen in reality. That is the reality. That is those things which are unlikely and impossible and treated with as peripheral side issues are actually the central issues. How many people saw the movie The Corporation? I just gave the links to that. Okay. So, this is the theory that is taught. There is a supply and demand curve. Now, actually, as the Hill and Myatt textbook says, supply and demand doesn't exist in most real world cases. I mean, it's a very supply curve exists only when you have very small firms operating under perfect competition. Whenever you have market power, then there is no supply curve, and that's the case for 90% of reality. And similarly, we didn't really go through this argument, although it's given in earlier. There is the famous Sonnenschein-Mantel-Debreu theorem, which says that you cannot aggregate demand across consumers. The properties of the aggregate demand function have nothing to do with the properties of the individual demand function. So there are many theorems which are derived in microeconomic theory, like the Slutsky theorem and sort of the compensated demand function and many other properties that you are made to study. Those all are valid for one consumer, but none of them hold for the aggregate demand curve. But the textbooks, even though they know this theorem, which was proved in the 70s or sometime, just ignore this and assume that whatever is true for one consumer is also true for the aggregate demand curve, and then they teach you this theory, and this is what is used in constructing aggregate demand functions and estimating them in the real world. So anyway, we go back to this imaginary world and study what they're trying to teach you. So now the supply curve, as we know, is the marginal cost curve. This is the key. So, and the demand curve is the marginal benefit curve. So basically, the supply and demand measure the marginal costs and the marginal benefits. And so the intersection of the supply and demand is the optimal quantity. This is a very famous theorem which is proved under an enormously complicated mathematical methodology, so that it makes people very impressed. But it's actually a very simple idea that, look, as we increase the quantity supplied, the benefit of production goes down, the cost of production goes up. But obviously, as long as the benefit is greater than the cost, you want to keep on producing. So at the intersection, the benefit exactly equals the cost. So that is the point at which you want to produce. If you go beyond that, then the benefits are lower, the costs are higher, so it's inefficient. If you are below that, then you can get more benefit at lesser cost, and so you should increase. So this is all, and this is enough. I mean, if you understand this, you have understood the whole 500 pages of variant. This is the main lesson that all of that book is trying to teach you. That basically the intersection of the supply and demand is the efficient place to produce, and once you absorb this, then you say that the free markets are efficient, because that's where they get to. Although none of these things are really valid in the real world. Now, one of the points that Hill and Myatt make is that they show that there is no supply curve in a monopoly or in a non-competitive industry. In any non-competitive industry, and in fact, as we showed, even in a competitive industry, the firms should be looking at marginal revenue and not at the demand curve. It's only by neglecting and setting one term equal to zero, which is not really equal to zero, that you get to this idea that basically the derivative of price with respect to quantity should be zero. The price should not change. Now this is never zero, but all right, let's give the assumption to them and let's assume that that derivative is zero. Then you have demand curve equals the marginal benefit. Otherwise, the marginal benefit curve is the marginal revenue, which always lies below the demand curve. Now, what this diagram shows is that depending on the demand curve, there are two different configurations shown in the right-hand side. The marginal revenue curve can intersect the marginal cost curve at exactly the same point, meaning that at price $5, you are producing 400. Also at price $7, you are again producing 400, depending on the demand. So the fact is that there is no supply curve in the sense that there is no unique price at which you will produce a fixed quantity. It also depends on the demand. So when the supply depends on the demand, then you cannot separate supply and demand. And this is the key to the supply and demand analysis, that you can think of demand separately, you can think of supply separately, put them together to get the equilibrium. Now what this curve shows, and what is true in general, is that supply and demand are intermingled. You cannot separate them, and if you can't separate them, then the whole supply and demand apparatus is just useless, because these two curves interact with each other. This so-called ceteris paribus assumption says that hold all other things constant, but those other things you are holding constant cannot be held constant because they change depending on the thing that you are analyzing. So now this is the key lesson of the textbooks, that the perfect competition is efficient, because in this figure you have the marginal cost curve and the marginal benefit curve. Now a perfectly competitive industry will produce at point A, because that's the intersection of the supply and the demand, because in the perfect competitive industry the demand curve is the marginal revenue curve, because the firms think of the price as given, and as Steve Keen has pointed out, if the demand curve is flat for every firm, then if you take the sum of all of them, it will still be flat. It cannot acquire a slope. So it's necessary for, even in a perfectly competitive industry, for the firm to have a little bit of slope. Now the only case where it doesn't work, actually this has been proven, is if you have an infinite number of firms, then it does work. Now, so but forget about that for the moment and think about the monopoly. Now in the monopoly you have only one firm, so now clearly the marginal revenue curve will be below the demand curve, so the intersection will occur at this QM, which is the monopoly price, and so this is what proves the inefficiency of the monopoly and the efficiency of perfect competition, in the sense that the quantity is less, so the marginal cost of production is higher, the marginal benefit, marginal cost is below the marginal benefit, and so basically this is again something which is called a social dilemma. For the society as a whole, it will pay for the production to be increased, because the marginal cost of production is less, marginal benefit is high, but the private benefit to the monopoly will not be positive. It will it will lose money if it expands production. So this is exactly the same issue that we have been talking about, that selfish behavior harms the society. Now, the main lesson that the Manichev text starts out by saying that greedy behavior is good for society. If everyone acts selfishly, this produces social benefit. Now, what he doesn't say is this is true only when you have perfect competition. It is not true when you have a monopoly. Here, the monopoly's selfish behavior causes harm to society. So why take that as the introductory lesson and not mention that this is true only when the firm cannot actually do anything to society? If the firm is so small that its actions have no impact on the society, then its effort to harm society will not cause any damage. But the lesson that Manichev draws from it and Varian draws from it is exactly the opposite. That this is true under general conditions, no matter what. They don't mention that this is not true for a monopoly. They should write that this is not true for oligopoly, this is not true for monopoly, this is not true for any firm which has any amount of market power. They should mention that when they say that selfish behavior will not cause damage, but they don't. No, the invisible hand is wonderful. If everybody acts for their own selfish interest, then this will cause benefit to society. Then this is the diagram on which it is based. This triangle, the shaded triangle, this is called the deadweight loss of monopoly, because that's the extra surplus that you can get if you move from monopoly to competition. So these are the textbook description of the inefficiency that comes from monopoly. First of all, there is the deadweight loss, that's the triangle that we have discussed. Then there is excess profits that are being gained by monopoly. So this excess profits is income that is going to the rich. There is rent seeking. Monopolies make profits because other firms are not coming in, so they try to create barriers to entry. And now you can have also a possibility in which the inefficiency is eliminated, which we have discussed. That's called the case of perfect price discrimination. If the monopolies don't have to charge one price to everybody, then they can actually charge people according to their marginal benefit, and then they can extract all the consumer surplus. So sometimes this is seen in doctors' offices, where in the USA, where you have sliding scale fees, where poor patients are charged less and rich people are charged more according to their ability to pay. And on the one hand, this is defended as equitable. On the other hand, this also has some unpleasant properties. So this perfect price discrimination reduces the deadweight loss, but it increases the equity cost, the idea that everyone should have a fair amount of income. Now, what does the textbook say as to what we should do about a monopoly? Well, there is the famous regulation. So if you set the price for the monopoly to a regulated ceiling, you could set the price to be perfectly competitive. You could say that this is the maximum you're allowed to charge. And so if you do that correctly, then the profit function of the monopoly becomes price times quantity minus the cost function, where the price is now fixed at the ceiling. Since the price cannot change, so then the objective function is exactly the same as what it is supposed to be for a perfectly competitive industry. So you get to exactly the same formula, price equals marginal cost, and then you will produce the correct amount according to the standard theory. And so you can create efficiency in a monopoly just by regulating it. There is, of course, a problem that the marginal cost is not known to you. It's known to the monopoly, so you will have to estimate these, and if you can do that correctly, you might be able to set price equal to marginal cost, but you might also make some mistakes, and in that case, if you make a mistake, you can create shortages. If you set the price too low, then the monopoly will produce too little and there will be excess demand. Or if you set the price too high, then there will be shortages or surplus supply. The firm will want to sell more, but the demand will not be available at that price. Now, that is the case when you have increasing marginal cost. As we have seen, increasing marginal cost is very rare in the real world. Usually it doesn't happen. The case of either constant marginal cost or decreasing marginal cost is much more common, and these are the cases where you have a natural monopoly. There should only be one firm because that is the best in terms of what is the cost to society. So now, this is the picture when you have constant marginal cost. If you have constant marginal cost, then the average cost is decreasing, because basically you have fixed cost which is being paid off every time you produce more. So the fixed cost goes to zero, and ultimately the average cost becomes equal to the marginal cost. So now in this situation, the same analysis apply. You have a demand curve, you have a marginal revenue curve, and the monopoly will produce at the monopoly price, which is at the intersection of the marginal revenue curve and the marginal cost curve, which is at which point you have a large amount of monopoly profits. Now, socially, it would be optimal for the production to expand to the intersection of the marginal cost and the demand curve. So now you cannot regulate the monopoly by setting price equal to marginal cost, because when you do that, your firm will want to produce infinite amounts. At least so in a natural monopoly, and also since the average cost is above, they will not be able to make a profit at this point. So one solution that has been suggested is that you should set price equal to marginal cost and subsidize the monopoly. This leads to other types of problems like rent seeking, etc. So one solution is to allow the firm to produce at a point where the profits are zero, and that is the case where the average cost equals the demand. So at that point, the monopoly makes zero profits, and the price is a little higher than the marginal cost, but it is lower than the monopoly cost, and so you get a lot of benefit from the regulation, but you don't have socially optimal production. So there are lots of this theory is very complicated. There are lots of books and materials on how we should regulate monopolies. We have, for example, in Pakistan, a Commission on Regulation of Prices, a ministry, and they use this kind of theory to decide how we should set the prices. But the problem is that this theory is completely bogus, and so the results that you get from this are very harmful. So this theory looks great on paper in the sense that, okay, we have now got an understanding of the theoretical foundations, and so we can use this to actually regulate firms. But the problem is that the main issues which have to do with industries have not even been taken into the picture. So a very wrong and misleading picture emerges of what happens. So even within the context of textbook theory, one doesn't have information about the demand function, one doesn't have information about the cost function, and these things are regularly changing. Just go back to, you see, one of the problems with this pure mathematical approach is that it cripples the ability of the students to think, because if I say, okay, tell me about this monopoly and find me any difficulties, so you will think about where the problems are in the math, because it has no relation to reality. Now if we think about the ice cream seller in the park, then everybody can think about that. And one thing it is clear, suppose we have a monopolist, which is a ice cream seller, how will we learn about the demand curve? I mean, every day you have a different number of consumers, a different number of people coming. How will you, suppose that I have perfect information, I want to regulate this ice cream to set the price at the point where marginal cost equals marginal benefit. How will I find out the demand curve? Even the ice cream seller doesn't know his demand curve, because every day he has different number of consumers. So the basic information required to implement this theory is lacking. Here, at least in the ice cream seller, we have clear-cut information about costs. There is no problem about that, because he is buying from wholesales. But the demand curve is random, variable, fluctuating. It will be very hard to figure out, and also it varies with the season. And if the day is hot, you will have a high demand. If the day is cold, you will have a low demand. So there is too much uncertainty about the demand function to be able to implement this idea. So, but that's one part. But according to this theory, if we take it even as given, we have problems because there's not enough information, and if you make mistakes in setting regulatory price, you can cause inefficiencies. But what happens, which is worse, is that you have something which is called regulatory capture. Basically, the regulations that you do will bring benefit to a large number of people, but they affect adversely a small number of people. So the standard problem of Olson that we mentioned last time, that the small number of people will tend to capture or affect the regulatory agency because they can act in a united way. The large number of people who are deriving benefits will not be able to influence the regulatory agency in the same way. For this reason, from the beginning, Islam has introduced the institution of Hisbah, which is actually a government institution designed to regulate markets from the first day, and that's essential. And exactly one of the ideas of the perfect competition theory is that regulation is harmful and bad. And so we can give some examples. You see, if you take your eyes away from the mathematics of the textbook and look at what happens in the real world, you can learn a lot. So there is a huge number of examples of regulatory capture. There was this congressman in US, Ken Salazar, who gave tax concessions to the oil companies and made many, and he was in and out of he was very friendly to the oil industry and protected their interest in many different ways. He was the head of the regulation company which protects the oceans, and then basically he made the organization toothless. The scientists would put in reports saying that this kind of drilling will cause harm, and these would be either doctored or suppressed, and agencies were given licenses for drilling even though they were not supposed to under the rules, and so on. So because the oil companies have a lot of power and influence and money and lobbying power, so they were able to get their own man appointed. So instead of the regulation agency bringing benefits to the people, it was actually used to cause harm to the people. Similarly, there was the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, which was designed to, say, in futures trading you have a lot of scandals which have occurred. People have been jailed for basically manipulating prices and so on. So this commission was supposed to take care of organizations or big parties trying to manipulate the stock prices. So one of the judges came to another judge and he said that I have made a promise to Wendy Graham, who later became board of directors of Enron that I will never rule in favor of somebody who's asking for, and that is what he did. He never, he just, anybody who filed a complaint, he was just given the runaround, prove this, that, and the other, and either his case was dismissed or he was made to settle for trivial amounts. Similarly, the Federal Aviation Agency in the USA regulates airlines. It's supposed to be concerned with passenger safety, but they were captured by the airline, so they became concerned by the airline profits. So they were supposed to ensure that the airlines are performing safety checks, etc., which are expensive. So, but they let them go and they gave them permission to fly with substandard aircrafts in order to. So basically, similarly, monetary policy agencies all over the world, they are supposed to set monetary policy to actually bring benefit to the nation, to create, to reduce unemployment, to reduce inflation. They tend to be captured by the banks, who use monetary policy to bring benefits to the banks. There is a opposition of interests. In general, for the nation, it is useful to have a loose monetary policy. If there's money is flowing everywhere, then people can get loans and they can buy things and they can produce. If money is, but of course the banks get low profits, because if money is freely available, then people will not, and loans will be cheaper, so banks can charge less money, and there will be more competition among the banks to give loans. On the other hand, if you have narrow or strict or tight monetary policy, this is harmful to the nation's growth, because now if you want to invest and if you want to conduct business, it's expensive to do so, so new business startup will be fewer, investment in the future will be less, but there will be more profits to the banks. So basically what happens is that the nation as a whole is too big, and it cannot combine its power to influence the monetary policy. The banks are few in number and they are large and powerful, and they can put their representatives onto this monetary policy committee. Very often it happens that the members are, just now it happened that the members of monetary policy committee, when they retire, they get very high appointments, high salary at banks. So MPC members who know that they can, that's what their future lies, they know what to do in order to please the banks, which is to keep the monetary policy tight, even if it's against the interest of the nation. So this kind of thing happens all the time. The WTO, the World Trade Organization, is supposed to make the trading field fair for all the nations, but in fact they they protect the interests of the big and the powerful nations against the poor and less politically powerful nations, and often carry out policies which cause great harm to the poor and undeveloped countries and bring great benefits to the rich and powerful countries, even though that's not supposedly their manifesto. So now that was the structure of of perfect competition, which doesn't exist. Now we look at the more realistic cases of monopolistic competition, at least as described in theory. So in theory, what we have is that in the monopolistic competition, the good scale of production would be at the bottom of the average cost curve, where the production would be efficient. But in monopolistic competition, every firm faces a demand curve which is individualized. They have their own differentiated product, so they have their own marginal revenue curve, and so they will produce less. So what is called a stylized fact, and a stylized fact is not really a fact about the real world, it's a fact which emerges from the theory, which probably may be or should be true about the real world. This is that in monopolistic competition, firms will produce less than the efficient amount. There will be what is called excess capacity, in the sense that they are able to produce more efficiently, but they don't do so because to do so would drive down their prices and reduce their profits. So that's the basic stylized fact that theory tells you about monopolistic competition. And also there is a efficiency loss which is measured by this triangle. Now the third structure is the oligopoly. And in the oligopoly, the main feature is that there is strategic interaction. The actions of firms influence each other. So one of the main things that emerges typically in oligopoly is that you have a prisoner's dilemma. If both firms cooperate to give you the monopolistic outcome, then both firms can maximize their profits. But usually at the so that is the collusion agreement. So both of them make profits of +2. Now, if they are colluding, if they have agreed, like the two ice cream sellers, they agree. This is the benefit of looking at real-world examples, because it can be understood. Even in this table, you can't understand what's happening. If I'm going to your next assignment, which will be given to you today, will be for you to run a prisoner's dilemma on your own. So if you run a prisoner's dilemma, if you just give them a table, nobody will understand anything from it, like happened in the first time you played. But if you explain the numbers in terms of a real world situation, everybody will understand that, look, you have two sellers of ice creams. Either you can play the collusion, we both agree to charge the same price, then you will split the sales and both of you will get half the profits. But let's make the perfect competition assumption. This makes things sharper, that anybody who cuts the price, he gets all the consumers. Or you don't have to, even without that, the one who cuts the price will get many more customers. So individually, if the other person, so both of you make an agreement, the other one honors his agreement, but you cut the prices, then you will make a profit at his expense. So that is the price discount. SO offers price discount, it makes +4, and the other guy loses money because of this, because of your betrayal. And similarly, if the other guy betrays, then he makes money at your expense. And if both people betray, then both people lose, or they both make 0. So this is the standard prisoner's dilemma. Now the standard analysis of this prisoner's dilemma is that the strategy to betray is the dominant strategy. Regardless of what the other guy does, it pays for you to betray. So, according to the standard theory which the economics has of human beings, that human beings have no honor, no dignity, they have no ethical and moral commitments. So, according to economic theory, everybody will always betray their agreement. This doesn't happen in the real world. So actually, the thousands and thousands of studies of prisoner's dilemma that you have in the literature, they are all studying why do human beings behave so foolishly as to honor their agreement, and in fact, when you look at the reality of the situation, the reality is that even from a purely materialistic point of view, it pays for both people to honor their agreement. It's very stupid to say that it is rational for both of people to betray and get 0. I don't understand, Yani, seriously, how you can think that the 0-0 is the strong Nash equilibrium and that is the predicted outcome, when it is worst for both players. Surely it makes sense. Surely human beings can figure out. Now the thing is that robots who are short-sighted and look purely for profit max and don't look at anything else, yes, maybe they will both betray each other. But human beings who understand that we have to live in this world, we have to live with this guy for a long time, we might be interacting with him at dinner and other places, and they are sensitive that this guy is going to say that, look, he made a commitment to me and betrayed me, and I'm going to be disgraced in front of other people. they will honor their agreement. and of course, yani, even from a purely materialistic point of view, if I can trust the other guy, then it pays for me to honor the agreement. And human beings know, I mean, over experience, a lifetime, we know who we can trust, and also we know who we can trust. So if you can build trust, you can get to the collusive agreement. So basically, as I said, the fundamental flaw of economic theory is lack of understanding of human behavior. And so they don't know what real human beings are like. They have made this model which is called the Homo economicus, who doesn't understand anything except dollars. And so then they say the Homo economicus is going to behave like this. I wonder why real human beings behave differently. So it's a very big problem for economists, but not at all difficult to understand for any human being. Alright, so now the issue arises, if we drop the maximization assumption, which leads us to the false and misleading conclusion in the prisoner's dilemma, then what do we do? This is the real question. How do we construct a new economic theory? So now, alhamdulillah, there is a lot of work that has been done which we can use. We are not left at zero that, okay, all of this theory doesn't exist, and now what should we do? We start thinking about it from scratch. No. Basically, what you do is that we do not maximize, because you cannot maximize. The ice cream seller does not know how to maximize profits because he doesn't know what the demand function is going. But he can follow certain rules, that this is what I am going to do. So in the oligopoly, what are the rules of behavior? The rules of behavior are not maximizing rules, they're just rules. So for example, Enron says that there is one strategy that I will collude. Okay, regardless of what the other guy does, I am going to play the cooperative strategy. That's one strategy. Or he says that I will collude in all periods except for the last. Or he can say that I will be responsive. I will collude if he colludes, but if he betrays, then I will betray him on the next round. This is called the tit for tat strategy. So now, none of these strategies are maximizing strategies. They're just rules of behavior. So now what we do in evolutionary economics is that we put in players into a pool. And we say, okay, this player is playing collusive strategy, this player is playing tit for tat, this player is playing betrayal strategy. And actually, this Axelrod, he ran a competition. He asked game theorists to design strategies. See, the game theorist, and he said, okay, you put in your strategy, I will program a player to play your strategy, and I will put them all into a pool, and I will see what happens. So what happened in this pool was that the tit for tat strategy did the best of all the strategies. There were many strategies which were designed. Actually, you see, you can beat the tit for tat strategy. I mean, if you know that the other player is playing tit for tat, then you know you can predict his behavior, and when you can predict his behavior, you can take advantage of it. But it turns out that if you try to take advantage of this behavior, then in a pool where there is a large number of players, somebody else will get the better of you. So this is what evolutionary economics is. What happens if you have different types? Some people are cooperative, some people are selfish, and they're always playing. So what happens when you allow this game to play? And this is something you cannot calculate by mathematics. You just have to do with the computer simulation, and that's what agent-based modeling does. You put in lots of different players and you see what happens in the long run, and it turns out this is what Axelrod says, the evolution of cooperation. You have many different types of strategies. It turns out that the tit for tat strategy is the robust strategy which wins over all comers. So basically the book is called Learning to Cooperate, or Evolutionary, and basically it turns out that if you follow some strategies, then you will notice that this tit for tat strategy works well, and so you will adopt it and you will get good results. So that is this book, the Hill and Myatt, shows the basic idea of this methodology, and it looks at three strategies for Enron and Esso. And so Esso is playing tit for tat, Enron plays three strategies, and among the three strategies, the collusion strategy wins against the tit for tat strategy. And the collusion in one period gets less, but of course these are just three possible strategies. You can have a lot of different strategies. Some of them would work well against, and some of them would work better. But ultimately it's not just, the other guy is also responding, so you have to think about, so basically, but this is the methodology, the mindset, the framework, which can be used to replace the maximization assumption, which is no good. And as I've said, we are just at the beginning. People are just beginning to see the things that can be done by using this type of method. So there is a lot of room for real research about real world. And today's assignment I will give you some ideas about how we can do these things. So we come back to the meta theory. Why not make the monopoly or oligopoly model the central model? So the economists have some arguments that might be made against this. One of them is that empirically competition is what describes most of the real world. If that was so, then we would have a justification to make perfect competition our model. But as we have already seen, this is not true. The empirical accuracy is very bad of the perfect competition model, and as many surveys show, Blinder says that the Blinder survey is the most recent one, shows that most firms operate with price making power, and therefore they are not perfectly competitive. So the empirical accuracy doesn't hold. This was found long time ago, and that is what Friedman came up with this as if philosophy to defend against, because people went to firms and took surveys and realized that firms are not setting price equal to marginal cost, and they don't even have any idea of what marginal costs are. So he invented this philosophy that we don't need to ask firms, we can just make theories without checking against firms. So we can just do our theory on pieces of paper, never look at the reality, and still we can arrive at the truth, which is just a very silly way of doing things, but that's what has been the dominant approach. And why? Because economic theory is not a science, it is an ideology. I have a paper, a small note by that name, which explains how this is so. So the ideology is that I believe something, and this is true regardless of any real facts that might exist in the world. So empirical accuracy is not valid, and economists have developed some defenses to the attack that your theory doesn't work in the real world. These defenses are false, but you can always, the battle is long. You can make an attack, and then economists have the option to try to reinterpret the empirical facts and to explain it away in different ways. Like, for example, the famous Card-Kruger study that showed that if you raise the minimum wage, it leads to increase in jobs, and basically it's due to information costs. Once you set the minimum wage at a high level, everybody knows what the wage is, so search costs goes down, and many efficiency effects take place. While when you don't have that, then different firms are hiring at different costs, and there are lots of frictions and serve costs. So the conventional economists attacked this study, and they found many different possibilities that maybe it's due to this and maybe it's due to that, in order to defend their theory. And then Card and Kruger came back with a response and showed that it is not due to this and it's not due to that. But the battle keeps continuing, and there's never any final answer. And so if you don't understand if you don't understand the meta theory, if you're just sticking with the facts, then you will never learn what is going on. But if you look at it from a higher level, who is trying to do what, then you can understand what is going on. So the second line of defense is that, okay, it's not empirically accurate, but it is approximately valid. It gives approximately the right results. It is a good approximation. So we've seen that this is not true. If you change the assumption very slightly, you get entirely different results. In the ice cream market, if you go from, if you take full information price competition, then the equilibrium converges to the 30-30, the minimum price, because both people cut. But if you allow for a little bit of loss of information, a little bit of transaction cost, it can converge to the monopoly price equilibrium. So these assumptions that we make to get perfect competition are not small and are not things which make only a little difference, but changing these assumptions change completely the picture that emerges. So the approximate validity is not true. So the final defense, and this is the real defense which is currently, that this is a normative theory. This is an idea. This is a benchmark, and this is actually what the name implies: perfect competition. And everybody admits that the competition can never be really perfect, but this is the ideal towards which we should try to go. So then, basically, it's a utopian theory. This is exactly the opposite of what economists tell you. Economists say that ours is a positive theory, and we don't deal with normative theories. But actually, the theory is a normative theory. It doesn't deal with positive facts about reality. So, but the way the economic theory works is that it says that this is utopia. We have perfect competition. We have marginal benefits equal to marginal cost. And whatever we do, if we try to move towards this utopia, then we will get better results. Consumers will be made better off, and the society as a whole will enjoy greater welfare. So now let us evaluate. This is the rest of the chapter of Hill and Myatt is devoted to trying to understand if this argument is valid. Is it true that we should try to move towards perfect competition? So there are 3 defects in perfect competition as a utopia, as a perfect state, as an ideal state towards which we should try to move the economy. These are all 3 mentioned in Hill and Myatt. So the first one is that the perfect competition leads to unjust and inequitable outcomes, which are not fair. They favor the wealthy and they disfavor the poor. The second objection is that it may be true in a static world, one-shot game, that you get efficiency, but if you have repeated games in which things are happening in time, then achieving efficiency in one period may be costly in terms of long-run dynamic efficiency. And the third objection is that even if you have a one-shot situation, the perfect competition doesn't lead to efficiency. So even on their own home ground, where you have everything matching the assumptions of perfect competition, even in that situation you don't have efficiency that is claimed for perfect competition. So regardless of how you view it, it is not a normative ideal. So we look at the first defense. First objection to the idea of perfect competition as ideal. And the first one is that you are measuring marginal benefits by willingness to pay. But the willingness to pay depends on the income. So if the rich man can afford to buy a yacht and the poor man cannot afford to buy medicine, then the efficiency is served by not producing medicine and producing the yacht for the rich man. So the example in the text is given that if somebody can only pay 10 rupees for bread and the other person can pay 100 rupees, then if there's only one bread, it should be given to the one who can pay more for it. But possibly the one who can pay more can afford to buy cake, and the one who cannot afford it can only buy bread. So if there's only one bread, it should be given to the poor person, because that's equitable, but not efficient, because the efficiency is measured by the surplus. not by need fulfillment. So, the problem is that the social welfare is not correctly measured by the willingness to pay. It is not correctly measured by the difference. As I said in last lecture, one of the effects of the positivist philosophy was that the three concepts, welfare, preference, and choice, these were all mixed up into one. So if somebody chooses something, that is good for him and that is his preference, and that is also socially beneficial. So this is not true. All three concepts are different. And so one of the things that is happening in this measure is that the background income distribution is taken as given. That is, the benefit is measured keeping this income distribution fixed. Whoever has income, that is the demand that is expressed. And so basically the rich people's demand has a much more impact on the market society than the poor people's demand, which doesn't express itself in willingness to pay. If you redistribute demand, then the entire, if you make the income distribution equitable, then the whole demand function will change. There will be more demand for food products and less demand for luxury products, and then again the calculation of the benefits will change. So how can we take this demand function as a given and do our welfare calculation on this basis when we don't know that the income distribution is an equitable one in the first place? So this is one of the basic problems with the measure of using consumer surplus as a measure of welfare, which is done in order to make competitive equilibrium look like it is efficient. If we use more sensible measures of welfare, then we will find that that the supply and demand intersection is not the best place. And in fact, maybe the demand function itself is the wrong thing to look at. Maybe we should restrict demand, and in fact we do that. We restrict demand for cigarettes, and we restrict demands for many harmful products, and we ban products which are socially harmful. So we change the demand function because we think that there is a social benefit which is different from the demand. The economist says, no, whatever you demand, that's whatever you like, that is what we should supply to maximize benefits. But we know as a society this is not true. So Hill and Myatt asked the hypothetical question that if some people are starving and you take food away from other people who are demanding it at a higher price and give it to them, will you create inefficiency? Yes. The answer is yes. According to your demand and supply theory, this will be highly inefficient. Actually, this is not a hypothetical question of Hill and Myatt. This is the true reality. Amartya Sen's very famous book, Poverty and Famine, an essay on entitlement and deprivation, argues that most people think, and even now this is still true, that famines occur because there is shortage of food. He studies real world famines. This is the main difference. When you go and study the real world, you learn things, as opposed to if you're drawing curves and writing equations. So he studied famines, and he asked, well, in the Great Bengal famine, was there a shortage of food? So he found that at the height of the famine, food was being shipped out of Calcutta. Why? Because the local people didn't have the money to buy the food. So it was not the scarcity of food. He says that the problem was due to the failure of entitlement. In a capitalist society, a person is entitled to food only if he can pay for it. If you cannot pay for it, you're not entitled to food. So because the English were very strong believers in free markets, so they said that, well, if the demand for food is in England and it's they are willing to pay high prices for this food, then let us ship it to England because that's efficient, and let these people starve, and that's also efficient because these people are not worth anything if they don't have any money, because the value of human life is the amount of money that you can make. These are the ideas with which you have been conditioned also. The students come to me and ask that, what should I do which will maximize my lifetime earnings? What is the job that will give me the largest income? Because according to you, your life is worth the amount of money that you make. And this actually is not correct. Your life is worth much more than all the treasure in the world. Actually, there is a hadith to this effect, that you are worth, but you don't understand your own value, that every human being has a unique potential to change the world, and you are conditioned into thinking that you are a tool which will be used in the factories of the capitalists to produce output. Anything that is unique about you, we are trying to rub out so that you can fit into the groove which is required to do the production. And so this is the job of an education, is to eliminate all the unique features of the students and to make them into interchangeable parts so they will fit into the capitalist machinery for production. And your value, which will be judged by the marketplace, is how well you can fit into the machinery to produce income. So there is a lecture of mine from last year which elaborates on this picture. Let's look at a simple, see, if you look at the real world, you can understand things when you don't look at math. So let's look at a very simple situation. You have 10 students and you have 10 houses. 10 students have demand at 1,000, 2,000. Basically, its demand is affording to pay. One student can afford to pay only 1,000 rupees for housing. The second student can pay 2,000, and there are 10 students and they can pay anything up to 10,000 just in sequence. So what's the demand curve? It's the blue line. One student can pay 10,000. So at the price of 10,000, you have only demand for one house. At 9,000, you have demand for two houses, and so on. At 1,000, you have demand for 10 houses. Similarly, the landlords vary in terms of their need for earning revenue. So one of the people who only needs to get, is very rich, he only needs to get 1,000. The other person needs to get 2,000 out of his rental. And so all of them up to 10,000. Again, the supply curve is a very simple linear curve. And so now, according to your theory, which you have been taught, the ideal equilibrium rent is 5,500 in this picture. At this price, 5 students will be able to afford the house, and 5 landlords will have houses that they can sell, that they can rent. The other 5 will be priced out of the market. They need more than they can get at the market price. So, is this so? According to the theory that you have been taught, this is the optimal and the efficient equilibrium. So, is this the best we can do in this situation? Use your own minds. What should we do?
Student who is willing to pay 1,000, he should go to the
we just match everybody. Match the students to the houses. Everybody gets housing. Everybody gets a renter, and so you see. Imagine the situation. This is I've taken this from Varian's example. So we have he uses this in chapter 2 or something for supply and demand. We have a cluster of houses near the university. Students who fail to find houses have to go to some remote area. Maybe they have to go back home, really, if you think of Islamabad, that if you can't find reasonable housing, then you can't study. You just have to say that, okay, it's not possible. So, if you use the supply and demand methodology, then 5 students will go back home. They can't afford housing in Islamabad and they will not be able to study. If we match landlords to students, everybody can study, and the landlords have what they want. There is no consumer surplus, but is consumer surplus more important than providing housing to all the students and providing renters? And these people, the landlords, they also have their needs for money. Maybe these are people who are earning to feed their family. So here the sort of the non-efficient solution is the one in which everybody gets housing, everybody gets a renter, and it seems that this is much more efficient than the so-called supply and demand equilibrium, which all the students are brainwashed into believing that this is the efficient solution. If you go to PIDE and you tell them, then they will say that this is the efficient solution. So that's one objection to the idea of perfect competition as being the ideal. Perfect is not the ideal. What happens, actually, you can, I didn't study this correctly, it is the poorest students who lose out from this solution. And this always happens in the market. The people who are the least able to pay, they are hurt the most by the market. And the people who have the most wealth, it is their demands which are fulfilled. And so market is always biased against the poor. So that's one objection to the market as the ideal mechanism for producing in a society. The second objection is static versus dynamic efficiency. So we have this monopoly which is earning excess profits, and we say that we should tax this away. The question is, why is this monopoly earning excess profits? So basically what Hill and Myatt say is that how did it get this monopoly? Well, maybe it invented something new which was beneficial, and now it wants to reap the returns on this, and so it has a patent which is giving it a monopoly, or it has made some innovation like Kareem and this Uber. So they are driving existing businesses out of business and they are making profits. Why? Because they created an innovation which is actually bringing a benefit to society, in the sense that people can get taxis at much cheaper price and much more convenience. So this is also, he says, it's a temporary advantage. Eventually other people will react and respond and create better services. The normal taxi services is responding to this by creating their own network of radio cabs and providing better service and lowering prices, so more competition. So what Schumpeter says about capitalism is that it is a process of creative destruction where continuously innovation is taking place, which drives the older firms out of business. It destroys old firms, but new, better firms come into the picture. So the textbook focus on perfect competition makes it impossible to consider dynamic efficiencies. Perfectly competitive firms have no surplus, no profits in order to do research and innovation. And why should they do? Because they are just one small firm among thousands of firms. Only the unique firms will be able to do research and innovation. So in Baumol, he says that regulation misled by misread theory is the name of the book. He says that currently in the real world we are regulating monopolies on the basis of extremely faulty theory. In the perfectly competitive model, which is used as the basis, you see, we are using this triangle theory to regulate monopolies, that we should set price equal to marginal competition. We should not let them have any excess profits. Now, in fact, Schumpeter showed that oligopoly is where most of the innovation takes place, because there's big firms, lots of them, and they are trying to compete with each other to get a bigger market share. So they are constantly trying to come up with new ideas to beat the other guy. So that's where you really have competition. In the so-called perfectly competitive industry, there is no competition. Each firm is too small to actually compete. They just follow rules. So real competition, which actually does have some benefits in the sense that it leads to a lot of innovation and a lot of... So that happens in the oligopoly. It doesn't happen in the so-called perfect competition. So now, suppose that you come into an oligopoly or a monopoly structure and you say that, okay, now what am I going to do is I'm going to set price equal to marginal cost, and I'm going to tax away all the profits to make you look like a perfectly competitive industry. What's going to happen? Well, these firms are not going to be able to do any research and development. They're not going to be able to innovate. So he says, Baumol, that actually that's what's used. And when you go in the USA, they have laws against monopolies. So lawyers go in and say that this monopoly is earning excess profit, so we should tax it away to achieve efficiency. They don't take into account the fact that these profits are going to be used to try to innovate. So basically the regulation is based on faulty theory and doesn't take into account the fact that you may be killing the goose which is laying the golden egg, because your theory is blind to it. So basically the Hill and Myatt say that you are trying to defend capitalism on the wrong grounds. I mean, capitalism does have some benefits, but these are not the benefits of the perfect competition model that are present in the textbook. Capitalism has benefits of dynamic efficiency, of innovation, of creative destruction. These are what Schumpeter, etc., have defended capitalism for. So if you look at the realities of capitalism, the harms are also different and the benefits are also different. So all of this will come by looking at real world models, not at the mathematical models which are taught in textbooks. Now, even on the normative ground, the idea, this is again related to the point about regulation, that okay, if you have a situation which is imperfect, and suppose that many things are required to move towards the perfect competition. So there is an idea that we can do this one step at a time. So what Lancaster's theory of the second best shows is that this is not true. If you are in a bad situation, there are many inefficiencies, and you remove one of them, then you can make the situation more inefficient. So very simple example, suppose you have a monopoly, and suppose you have a monopsony, a firm which is hiring, or a collection of firms which is united in terms of its hiring of labor. So in that case, the firms can have market power, and they can set the labor wage to be lower than the equilibrium market wage, and thereby extract surplus from the laborers and get profits. And basically this is the situation which Karl Marx was concerned about, and he said that this is always the case, that the capitalists always have market power in the labor market, and they always exploit the laborers, and they always set the wage equal to the survival cost, which is the minimum wage required for survival. So on the one hand you have this monopsony, on the other hand you have this labor union. The labor union fights against unites the laborers, so this is not perfect competition. So now in this situation, if you, according to the standard theory, perfect competition, if we break up any one of them, we will lead to inefficiency. I mean, the move towards perfect competition involves breaking up both. So if you break up both, then you would get to perfect competition with its supposed benefits. But suppose that we take one step towards perfect competition by either breaking up the labor union or by getting rid of the monopsony. Then you get to an inefficient outcome, because the two powers offset each other, and you can get to a relatively good outcome if you have both of those sides having market power. But if you break up either one of them, then the one that you break up will be exploited by the other, and you will get to an inefficient outcome. So taking small steps towards perfect competition does not lead to efficiency. Either you have to get there all in one place, you have to put in all of the 7 assumptions, you have to provide full information, zero transaction cost, small firms, small minimum efficient scale, and so on and so forth. And then you can get to the theoretical benefits of perfect competition. But if you have these 7 problems and you say, okay, let's improve in one of the directions, so we will at least be moving towards perfect competition, then the theory of the second best said that you can make things worse off instead of improving them. Maybe these inefficiencies are offsetting each other to some extent. And in the real world, this happens because you have lots of different forces and you have some sort of an equilibrium which has emerged by balance. If you disturb the balance, something will, you are making an intervention. Now this intervention, you don't, the system has evolved through a natural process. You make an intervention, you don't know what's going to happen because you haven't studied all of the forces. So you don't know whether things will improve or whether they will become worse off, because you're using the wrong theory which is to guide you towards what is good and what is bad. There is a cartoon from the book, and the cartoon basically says that, look, people are always complaining about public goods, that public transit has to be subsidized. Meanwhile, if you have an efficient public transit, you don't have congestion on the roads because not everybody is driving, and you don't have pollution, and you don't have the healthcare system which is required to deal with the problems of pollution, and then you have insurance, and you have a huge number of extra costs which are all being paid in the private market, and the government is providing institutional structures. So incurring one public cost to save all those private costs is an efficiency, but people don't realize this because of the ideology of perfect markets. It doesn't allow you to see the benefits that come from the provision of public services. You only count the costs, but you don't count the benefits. So the way of thinking taught by conventional textbooks looks at only certain costs and does not consider all of the benefits because those are out of the picture, and so you cannot get to a correct understanding of the situation. And therefore you always recommend privatization, even though it has frequently fails in the real world. So another objection to the triangle analysis, which shows that the perfect competition is superior to monopoly, is that actually you are comparing apples and oranges, because now we go in a little bit deeper into the argument. Can we take an industry which is competitive and put in a monopoly over there? Or can we take a natural monopoly and make a competitive industry out of it? Typically the answer is no. The supply curves of the monopoly are different from the supply curves of the competitive firms, and you can't add up all of those firms to get to the monopoly, as we have said. Similarly, the demand curves are different when you have a monopoly. The monopoly might advertise to create demand. The competitive curve doesn't have any money to advertise, and it doesn't make any sense to advertise because they don't have a differentiated product. So we are looking at entirely two different worlds. The world in which the monopoly exists will have different cost structure, will have different demand structure. So we can't really compare. The picture in which you are taking a triangle is one in which you are saying that there is a monopoly, but the monopoly world has different supply curve, different demand curve. It's not the same picture anymore. So you can't really compare perfect competition with monopoly. So this whole thing is comparison efficiencies are useless. PC as a normative ideal fails because the cost of regulation might be high. People have tried to estimate the deadweight loss due to monopoly, and they have either come up with nothing or have come up with very small and insignificant estimates. Nobody has been able to prove that, yes, if you have a monopoly and if you break it up and make it into competitive industries, you will get a better result. In fact, most results show the negative effect, that AT&T was a big monopoly on telephones in the US. When it was broken up into small telephone companies to create competition, the cost to consumers went up, exactly the opposite of the prediction of perfect competition, that the cost will go down and the volume will go up. And this is typically the case, that when you one of the things that the analysis neglects, again we have discussed this, that the moral and the ethical and the equity issues are completely bypassed, and the fact that markets are inequitable does not get discussed anywhere. Also, there are many other ethical issues which arise in markets. So if somebody wants to buy a baby and somebody wants to sell the baby, then that's efficient. You have consumer surplus, and if the marginal cost to the seller is low and the marginal benefit to the buyer is high, then you should allow this transaction. So according to economic theory, there is no objection that can be raised to this, except that the legal framework. So he says that, H&M say that the people who are thoughtful, moral, ethical, they stay away from economics. They read economics and they go out. And so the less thoughtful, shallow students who have no any depth of thought, they go into economics and they come out thinking that all of these stupid people, they are putting up objections to markets. They don't understand what the wonderful things will happen if we just allow free markets to operate, and that's why they don't understand. They are not aware of the ethical and moral problems with markets. So everything is for sale in market societies. Recently, there's an article on that in a book about what is for sale in market societies. So children are actually for sale in market societies. You can buy foreheads to put your advertisements on. You can buy the backs of people to put your parent care, child care is for sale. Now, why is this so? This is not so in traditional societies, but in the market society, basically everybody is put into this rat race for consumption, so that, today everybody works a lot harder. The father has to work and the mother has to work in order to earn just enough to get by, because the standards of living have been raised so high, and yet that everybody needs to work in order, and this is exactly the purpose of the capitalist society, that you produce a lot and you consume a lot and you work a lot in order to be able to produce a lot and to consume a lot, and everybody would be much happier at much simpler standard of living. This has been also established. Easterlin's paradox of happiness shows that production has increased by many times and consumption has increased by many times, but happiness has not changed at all. So the book on what is for sale mentions that you can, if you are in prison, you can get a cell upgrade by paying $90. You can get a better prison cell. There are carpool lanes in which you have to go. 4 people have to drive, so that they can. That's supposed to reduce congestion, so that if you put in more people, then you can. Then instead of 4 cars, 1 car will be there. But if you pay, you can get into this lane also. Services of an Indian surrogate mother for Western couples, $8,000. You can have your baby implanted into a womb of a Indian woman. Right to shoot an endangered black rhino is $250,000. You can buy your doctor's cell phone number for $1,500. If you want to pollute, you can pay $10.50. If you have $500,000, you can immigrate to the US. So, one part of the story that is absent from conventional textbooks is the law, the norms. The law embodies social commitments, that you will not have slavery. So there are some things which are called transaction goods, like bottle, radios, computers, and there are some things which are called experience goods, which are based on relations and contracts and long-term trust. So these two are different. The textbooks are only teaching about goods like widgets, which is what they call them, which don't matter to anybody. But there are many other things where you want to have the guarantee of the person who is selling, because the good is complex. And then you need to have trust. You can't have an impersonal transaction. So in these situations, then there are many issues that arise which are not typically dealt with in market transactions, where you get the money and you give the good. So markets are not independent creatures. They are embedded within a framework of law, of ethics, of morality. You can't take them out of that. So once you understand this, then this whole idea of government versus private market makes no sense, because private markets are made possible by the existence of the government, which takes care of what happens if there is cheating, what happens if there is breakdown. So, and also the social norms which dictate how people will behave towards each other. Without these, you can't have a market in the abstract. So the policy that is made ignores these things, the government, the normative framework. And the most important example of the failure caused by this kind of mindset was Jeffrey Sachs, who was trained at Harvard, and he went in very confidently into Russia, and he sort of forced them. It was called the shock strategy. They were wanted to convert from communism to free markets, but they wanted to do it at a slow pace. He said, no, do it right away in one shot, in a shock strategy. So he arranged some loans, and what happened was that the output of Russia went down by 50% in 1 year. Lots of hunger and malnutrition and starvation occurred. A few millionaires got made, and basically you had capitalism going again. So the thing is that massive damage was caused by this ideological framework that free markets are best, period. You don't need to worry about anything else. If you put in free markets, it will automatically get you the best results. So the arguments are made by firms all the time that if we deregulate, we will get more competition, lower prices, more output. But when you look at who is lobbying for this, you find that it's the firms and not the consumers. The consumers want regulation, they want protection against the firms. And the firms are paying huge amounts of money to get deregulation, which they say will benefit the consumer. So how come they are spending money to benefit the consumer? If they are deriving lots of benefits from this regulation, then the consumer should be lobbying for it. But actually, these theories are used as weapons and tools of deceptions and fraud to deceive. The famous the book which has just come out recently in a reprint is the Hitman. What is it? Confessions of an Economic Hitman. They use false theories to deceive nations into pursuing policies which are against their interest. They basically sell them loans. They say, if you take this loan, there will be so much benefit to you. And then they actually became enslaved and entrapped by the cycle, and they have to keep paying interest. One of the presidents of Nigeria, Obasanjo, he said at a conference that made the mistake of taking an 8 billion loan. Now 10 years later I have paid off 16 billion and there is still 24 billion left. Alright, so I think we have gone over the time, so we will stop here. That was the last time.